Um, Thanks so much to the organizers for having our paper in the program. My name is Giorgia Barboni. I'm an assistant professor of finance at Warwick Business School. This is joint work with Antonio Cetturo, Michele Cascarano, Emilia Garcia Pendini, and Marco Tomasi. And since 3 out of 4 of my co-authors are from central banks, then the usual disclaimers apply. So from Filippo's presentation about the role of banks and climate risk, what I want to tell you about in the next 25 minutes is the role of banks in the green transition and investments in green technologies. So again, we are in this room. The theme of today's talk is really about finance and climate change, and I really like also these strong policy focus that we have, and I think that we all agree that we all have to make a huge amount of efforts in order to be able to reduce pollution emission, and to achieve this objective, everyone has to make some efforts, firms, governments, households. And what we precisely study in this paper is to what extent credit supply, so what is the role of banks in firms' investment in green technologies. So stated in our words, what's the role of banks for the green transition, with the focus particularly on firms. So when we started tackling this paper and thinking about somewhat the conceptual framework around the relationship between credit supply and investment, well, I mean, there's a very consolidated literature that suggests that there's a positive relationship between investment and credit supply, and I don't think I need to convince you about that. Then we kind of started thinking about what about green investments? Does the same relationship between credit supply and investment, general investment, hold for investments in green technologies as well? And we kind of delved into different type of theories and stories. So on the one hand, I mean, it's not entirely clear whether whether credit supply may precisely lead to a positive relationship on green investments. Why is that the case? Well, green investments may be undertaken by firms in order to somewhat mitigate the negative effects of their investments, and these may not necessarily be aligned with the profit maximization logic. And there are also papers, for instance, by Acemoglu, showing that credit per se may not be super effective in promoting investment in green technologies unless it's supported by interventions, for instance, in the form of subsidies. On the other hand, I think, again, we can all agree that there is a growing evidence and growing literature showing that more and more entrepreneurs and investors reveal social and environmental preferences in their investments, but also there may be regulatory reasons behind investment in green technologies supported by credit supply, in the form, for instance, of firms' beliefs about regulation may lead precisely in investments that are meant to abate pollution. And there's also a stream of literature showing a relationship between credit constraints and pollution level. So against this background, what do we do? So we focus on Italy, and we especially focus on a sector that is particularly reliant on bank credit, which are small and medium enterprises in Italy. We then follow an approach whereby we use textual algorithms to extract actual investments that firms make. And where do we find this information? We find this information from the financial statements of Italian SMEs in the time span between 2015 and 2019. We then combine this information with loan level data from the Italian credit registry, and we use these ingredients to essentially estimate the elasticity of green investments to credit supply. Then in doing so, we are perfectly aware that there's an identification challenge represented by the endogeneity between credit and investment. I'll spend some of the slides trying to convince you that we have overcome this challenge through an NIV approach, whereby we estimate bank lending policies that are purged of local and sector loan demand using shares at Italy level. And our instrument that is at the firm year level is then at a weighted average of lending bank policies across firm lenders. And we use an approach akin to Burton et al. And Greenstone et al. And then we have a great richness of data thanks to the different data sets that we are able to use. And this allows us to essentially exploit and explore heterogeneities across firms, industries, and geographies. And I guess to address Adair's point in the previous presentation, I think we can say a lot about where policy can go precisely thanks to these data. So let me give you a preview of our results. What do we find? We do find that firms' likelihood to invest in green technologies does respond significantly and positively to credit supply. How so? Well, one standard deviation increase in credit supply does translate in the probability of firms to invest in green technologies that ranges between 1.9 percentage points to 3.4 percentage points. And since the standard deviation of this probability that firms invest in green technologies is about 0.24, basically our effects are up to 14% of this credit supply standard deviation. What do we find? We find that the effect is concentrated among what we call the best firms, and I'll have a few slides showing you what these best firms are, and they also coincide with investment peaks. So in some sense, our results hint at the role of capital intensity and upfront capital as critical for this investment in green technologies in the face of credit supply. We do find that our effects are largely driven by high environmental awareness, and I'll then explain you what we mean by environmental awareness. We have different measures about that. We also do find that government subsidies and market competition do not have as strong an effect as we were expecting, at least from what the previous literature shows us, what the literature shows us. We do find, however, they have a role only if they are combined, they are enforced by environmental awareness. And we do not find evidence of regulatory or transition risk driving the results. So basically, most of these papers that I'm showing you here are personified by the people in this room. There are a bunch of authors here, and so I don't have really to explain much how, which type of literature we tap on. What I think we want to kind of say here is that we do focus on the role of banking sector in the green transition, thanks to having been able to extract green investments from firms' balance sheet. And at the same time, and this allows us basically to estimate the elasticity of green investment to credit supply. So let me get started on the data. So where do we start? So our data starting point was the Italian Chamber of Commerce. So we draw text information from notes to firms' financial statements. So every time a firm in Italy has to present the balance sheet to the tax authority, then what happens is that essentially below each type of voices in the balance sheet, there are some notes that are added to explain precisely what type of asset or any of these voices represent. These information is available for firms filing the most complete type of balance sheet. So essentially, we are restricting our sample to relatively larger SMEs because the very small firms, they just file what is called in Italy a simplified balance sheet where there's text information are not available. So through the balance sheet, what we are really focusing on are these text comments about tangible and intangible assets. We combine these text information, and I'll tell you more in the coming slides how we do work with this text information with balance sheet and other firm level information. Then we have the Italian credit registry data, which tell us loan level information both in terms of lenders and amounts. And finally, our sample is approximately 114,000 firm year observation, which, as I told you, we have available between 2015 and 2019. Okay, wow, that was fast presentation. Sorry. Okay. So, how do we identify green investments? Well, we start by creating our own dictionary that consists of approximately 80 green words or tags. And this dictionary is built upon different sources, the EU taxonomy for environmental sustainable activities, a dictionary that is present already from the work of Sotner and co-authors, but also some of the largest firms in Italy do file what are called the sustainability balance sheets, and so they use some terms that we borrow from there. So imagine that the capital WIT is the set of words in the notes to the balance sheet of a firm that we can analyze. We do define a firm as undertaking green investment through a green investment dummy, again for firm I in ERT. And this is whether essentially we do find some intersection between these set of words that are present in the notes with the dictionary that we have created. And in that specific year, the capex is positive. And if you have questions, I can then explain why we use this restriction about capital expenditures with positive. And, okay, so perfect. So we have approximately 6% of firms being green across the year. And in terms of taking unique firms, we have almost 10% of firms having undertaken some green investments through our study period. What's our empirical model? Well, it's pretty straightforward. So we estimate the impact of a symmetric growth rate of credit on the probability that a firm has undertaken some green investment in year T. Again, this is posed by identification challenges, meaning that loans that we observe are equilibrium outcomes, and there could be a problem of inverse causality. We, first of all, control for demand factors in terms of firm characteristics, time invariant firm characteristics. We use fixed effects to control for innovation shocks and demand shifters, and our most saturated specification precisely use the approach pioneered by Haas, and we are happy to have him as a discussant in terms of sector, size, location, and time fixed effect. So how do we construct our instrument? So we essentially instrument this symmetric growth rate of credit through a credit supply index in the following. So we first estimate credit supply from each bank in each year to firms in a given sector in a given location, using all the loans that are disbursed by that bank in that sector and in that location. And then once we estimate this delta BT, our estimated credit supply, we then compute our credit supply index, which is the weighted average of all these delta BT of all the banks lending to firm I at the start of the period. So this is how our CSI look like through the years. There is quite some variability, and the reason why we plot this is also to have some benchmark with their other statistics. So if you look at our time span here from 2010 up to, for instance, 2012, you can see that essentially this matches quite well with changes in bank lending standards, and this is from the European BLS. Okay, so let me get through our main specification and main results. So on the below panel, you can see the first stage where we see a strong and positive and significant relationship between our instrument and credit growth. And then our above panel precisely represents the relationship between delta loan and the probability that the firm in a given year has undertaken some investment in green technologies. We see that the coefficient is positive and significant across the different specification, even when we use our most saturated model in column 4. So in the next, I guess, 7-8 minutes, what I'm going to do is to try to convince you about our results, what drives our results, and a set of different robustness checks. So we build from existing theories to essentially explore what drives this positive response of green investment to credit supply. So first of all, we look at essentially the role of credit constraints in the sense of high cost of environmental investments, whether they might be driven our main results. We look at environmental preferences. We study then the role of government subsidies, market competition, but also regulatory and transition risk. So first of all, we look, what we do is to do a sample split. So essentially what you can see here in the first and the third columns are the betas, as in our main table, that are estimated by using our main identification estimation regression, where we create subsamples by different type of firms' characteristics: profitability, liquidity, size, and age. And we do see that essentially our results are driven by the best firms, those that are consistently more profitable, have more liquidity, are bigger, and are older. We then look at whether or not green investments do coincide with an investment peaks. And we do actually, again, find evidence that high upfront costs do play a role in investment. And in fact, we do see that investments in green technologies are positive precisely when there is a high investment growth, and we also define investment peak with a standard definition in the literature, and both results are consistent one with the other. We then move into the role of environmental awareness, and we have two measures of environmental awareness. One is taken from the World Value Survey, whereby essentially we look at whether, the question is asking respondents where they do prefer growth to environmental protection. So in this case, it's 1 when the respondents state that they prefer environmental protection to growth, to economic growth. And the second set of results are climate change from Google searches. And what we find is that our results are essentially driven by areas, by locations in which environmental protection and environmental awareness at large is highest. We then look at the role of green subsidies. We do essentially, we do see some results of green subsidies, of high subsidies driving our results, but in particular, we do find that green subsidies matter, particularly when we interact them with environmental protection, with environmental awareness. Otherwise, essentially their effects is washed away. What is the main take-home message of this table is that government subsidies may be not sufficient per se to drive the positive response to credit supply. And subsidies tend to be more effective when they are combined with environmental awareness. Okay. We also explore the role of competition. The literature suggests that when competition is higher, firms are more likely to undertake green investment. But again, we do see and observe an effect of competition only when it's combined with environmental awareness. And we have a few other results that I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A section. We don't find the regulatory risk being driving our results, but let me conclude because I think we are right on time. 2 minutes, perfect. So we explore whether firms' decision to invest in green technologies respond positively or not to credit supply. We do find that it does, and it's largely driven by firms with high internal resources, so the best firms that I was showing you in terms of liquidity, profitability, age, and size. It's largely driven by local preferences for a green economy, and on the other hand, we do not find as much role of subsidies and market competition as suggested by the literature. We do find an effect of competition and subsidies only when the environmental awareness among the population is high. And we do not find evidence that regulatory risk matters. What are the policy implications of that? Well, first of all, that policies that incentivize lending to green projects can accelerate the green transition. Our results strongly suggest that such initiatives are more effective if accompanied by campaigns that raise environmental awareness among the population. Something else that we also mention here is, and in the paper particularly, is that we should also be considering other downstream impacts of recessions, in a sense that they may also lead to inhibition of investments by firms in green technologies. Thank you very much.
The discussant is Haas, please. Can you pronounce your last name?
Degryse. Degryse. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, for the invitation to come to Stockholm and having such nice weather over here. So it couldn't be better. So it's a pleasure to discuss this paper by Giorgia on credit supply and green investments. So what is the research topic of this paper? Well, of course, it's related to the conference theme being how to harness finance for climate. And so we know that several financiers or groups of financiers can be important. Think about stock markets, venture capital, private equity, what have you, governments. But here the focus is really on the role of banks. Okay? And so this paper focuses on banks as external financiers and is addressing the following question, being, does an increase in bank credit supply affect firms' likelihood to invest in green technologies? Okay? And so, as Giorgia was mentioning, this is not clear ex ante, because, on the one hand, if you would think it's about financial reasons, then to some extent, green investments may actually not react to credit supply if there is no profit motivation. On the other hand, if it is for pro-social reasons, then probably we could expect a positive effect of credit supply if the borrower is somehow internalizing some of the externalities. Okay? Okay. Sure. Oh, now it moves. Yeah, sorry. Maybe I should. Now it has moved. Yeah. Okay, so now I have a backup. Okay, so feeling threatened now. Okay, so why is this relevant? So SMEs around the world, we know that SMEs around the world are mainly dependent on bank finance for financing their investments. And the focus here is on Italian firms. And so, yes, Italy is a representative country, at least in this case, with many SMEs. So firms are there particularly bank dependent. Mostly, at least from the previous literature, we know that Italian firms are actually having multiple lending relationships. And so this might actually affect the impact of credit supply shocks. And so when I'm putting something in red, it's more like a comment. And so maybe you might want to study whether the effect of credit supply shocks is actually different with multiple relationships or not. So to some extent, my worry here might be that maybe, let's say, the extremes of credit supply shocks might be correlated with, let's say, single relationship firms, okay? And so maybe having multiple relationships might already undo some of it. That may be something you might want to look into. Okay, so what is the contribution? The novelty, well, what the authors are doing here is something novel, which is textual analysis to identify green investments by SMEs. So following the literature on analyzing conference calls for publicly listed firms. Okay, and so this is different, let's say, from previous literature, which is looking at self-reported commitments, like, for example, through CDP or other initiatives. So they combine this with the banking literature on credit supply or on identifying credit supply shocks, and they speak and contribute to several strands of literature. So which is nice, you know. So they, you know, they position them very nicely, let's say, within several sets of literature. And so the bottom line is that they bring a positive message of banks fostering green investments, or at least credit supply. However, it seems to work mostly when there are subsidies and when there is climate awareness or environmental awareness. Okay, so somehow you need to have those two animals in place in order to, so there are those two double complementarities happening. Okay. So the main findings, so what do they find is a large positive elasticity of green investment to credit supply. So they find that the one standard deviation in credit supply induces a 1.9 to 3.4 percentage point increase in the likelihood. One thing here is I'm not sure whether your interpretation is actually entirely correct. And so what I would think is that, you know, if you have an exogenous shock to CSI, you know, that, so the correct standard deviation, I think, for credit supply is the one of the standard deviation of the CSI times your first stage coefficients, times the coefficient of the change in loan, okay? So then you get to 0.3 percentage points. You may say this is low, but actually, comparing this to an average of 6 percentage points, it's still not that low, okay? I'm not 100% sure on this because many people are somehow mixing this up, but I think this is the more correct interpretation. You don't have effect on other regular investments. One concern there might be that maybe do you also check whether they have similar investment peaks, okay? So you might be maybe doing a match on that. So positive elasticity is concentrated among a subset of firms, and as already mentioned, this complementarity with government subsidies and environmental awareness. Okay, so good that I skipped the previous slide. So these were some additional results. So let me go to, so what is the methodology? So the novelty here is indeed that I identify this green investment using this textual algorithms. And so when they have at least one word in the dictionary in these notes, then they say, okay, there is a green investment, otherwise it's not, okay? So we have around 6% of firm year observations having green investments. That's already a stylized fact. I mean, we don't know a lot about this. Is this a lot or not? I was somehow disappointed. That was 6%. Even if there is some greenwashing in there, 6% only, okay? So 10% of the firms over this sample period does it at least once, okay? So this is actually quite low, okay? So maybe it's disappointing, I don't know. So the regression model includes firm fixed effects. I have a little bit, I understand that we all do this in the empirical literature, but then somehow the variation that you're capturing here is really coming from firms which are having not or having which are having a change. Of course, it might also be interesting to learn something about, let's say, firms which are persistently doing green investments, okay? And so somehow I think you're more or less missing this, which might actually be a very interesting group. So then what the authors do here is they are creating this CSI measure. So basically the idea here is that you are identifying this delta BT, so basically this specific bank time supply shock. You're measuring, averaging this across, let's say, the weights that every firm is borrowing from a particular set of banks. This gives your measure. And so somehow I found a little bit of a disconnect between how you measure your delta loan, which is this Davis-Haltiwanger growth rate. So this is basically, you look at the intensive and extensive margin combined. That's a nice measure. But then somehow when you're looking at your CSI shock, you're only looking at the intensive margin. Okay? And so I think maybe there are some ways to disentangle a bit more or to do some more additional exercises on this. So so let me come to my comments. I have 3 comments. I know I don't have so much time. So the first comment is on the firm-specific credit supply measure. I'm fine with the way how you measure it. The only possible worry here could be that if you think about the delta BT there, that of course the identification for, let's say, banks which are global, that is across Italy, is going to come from cross-province, cross-time. If you look at local banks, let's say within the province, this is only going to come from, let's say, province heterogeneity within the province, okay? And so I'm just wondering whether maybe the extremes might be correlated with, let's say, more local banks, maybe cooperative banks, I don't know what, okay? So again, I'm not saying that this is the case, but you might want to study a little bit more, whether the extreme supply shocks that you're having, whether they might be picking up particular type of business models, okay? I don't know. So to the upside, what the authors are finding is that within the period 2015 to 2020, let's say the average credit supply shock is actually is close to 0. So there is much more variation within the period that you would expect to have it. Of course, what could still here be, so one thing that would be interesting to know is whether the same banks are persistently in the tail of the distribution, okay? So this is following up on my previous comment. So let me come to my second comment, which is on detection analysis. Nice job. I think it's really cool that you do that. So let me mention some possible concerns. So the one thing is that, so you gather the information which are starting from dictionaries which are used or which are stemming from, let's say, publicly listed firms, okay? And so then if you look at the outcome for your firms, what you're seeing is that the large firms are the guys who are doing more green investment, the smaller firms less. So I'm just wondering whether the dictionary that you're using is not somehow positively correlated, let's say, with firm size. Again, so you might want to think a little bit about that. Oops, you're moving my slides. Okay, that's fantastic. So you're regulating my discussion. Okay, I know we are in Sweden, so that's a different environment. So then, okay. So one additional exercise you might want to do is make the distinction between tangible and intangible assets. So now you're somehow pooling this. But we know that banks care a lot about collateral. So maybe there is also some insight that you might get from how does credit supply affect tangible versus intangible assets. And let me come to my final comment, the third comment, which is more like a thought. So when you compare your results from OLS versus the two-stage least squares, so what you here have in table 4 is for the green investments. What you have in table 5 is regular investments, okay? So what you then are seeing is that if you do OLS for the green investments, it's not, delta loan is not significant. Do you do the same in regular investments? It's significant. And the opposite with the IV, okay? Again, that's perfectly possible, but I would somehow want to understand a little bit more, why is this actually happening, okay? So somehow here you need your IV to make this work, and here your IV somehow kills this, okay? And so, where is this potential? So in what direction does the bias work here? And I didn't see this completely, okay? So let me conclude. I know I'm out of time. So I think there are many things to like in this paper because they combine recent methods to learn something about green investments for a set of firms we know little about. And so that's I think, definitely an upside. We might want to know a little bit more about what are these green investments, are these tangible investments, intangible ones, what are those type of firms. So it speaks to various literatures, and I think it's consistent with many. So some suggestions to think about a deeper interpretation. I would say good luck also in the publication process. Thank you.